Kathy Herbage, my wife, and a spouse for more than 40 years. And she's been into rocks all her life, and she's going to talk about rocks, especially the local community.
So, last week, Jerry said, gee, they don't have a presenter next week. Would you be willing to talk about rocks? And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, okay, I guess so. And I started out, just kind of thinking about my rock tumbling adventures. And just to let people know, I do not claim to be an expert. I started tumbling rocks a month ago.
Oh.
But I started collecting rocks when I was a little girl. And both of my grandparents, well, 3 of my 4 grandparents were just really into rock collecting. I had a set of grandparents that used to come visit us, take us to the beach when they were up here, collected glass floats, glass rocks. My aunt and grandparents had tables that they had topped with rocks. Their bridge playing table was covered in a collage of rocks. And my other grandfather liked thunder eggs and geodes and had lapidary equipment would cut rocks. It was just a hobby for both of them. So I grew up from the time I was really little, seeing grandparents enjoying and touching and collecting rocks. One grandparent had a geology collection with all the labeled minerals in it, and I used to go down to the basement and spend hours looking at all of those rocks. So, and then as a child, most of my time growing up was on the Umpqua River, and my dad would take me fishing with him. And I would fish for a while, and when I got tired of fishing, then I would collect rocks. And I have one story. I was the oldest of 6 children, and my rock collections was always very difficult to find a place to put my rocks that younger siblings wouldn't get into them. I had agates that I stored in egg cartons, and always was finding younger siblings into those. And one day I took a shovel and I took my agates out and I buried them so my siblings couldn't get into them again. I was never able to find those agates again. But in any case, I loved rocks when I was in high school. My first career goal was to be a geologist, and changed that until I was a senior in high school. But I've never lost my love of rocks and pursuing other things. So a year ago, right after the COVID lockdowns started, my husband and I started going down, at least a couple of times a week to the beach and collecting rocks, because it was one of the few places you could be where you didn't have to deal with other people and you didn't have to deal with masks. And so we really spent a lot of time down there taking buckets, and to start with, we were bringing rocks up to put in the paths around our dahlia garden to make them more colorful. We used to have just plain old gray gravel. Now we have our own beach, so to speak, of beautiful rocks. And we would bring the rocks in and dump them in the sink after hosing them off and ooh and ah over the different rocks. And after a while, I started saying, well, that rock's too pretty to go out in the dahlia garden. And collecting rocks until I had, I don't know, like 9 bags full of rocks, gallon-sized bags full of rocks that I had collected. And so then I decided to get the tumbler, the first tumbler that I got, but life was busy, and so I didn't actually ever break it out and start using it until about a month ago. And as soon as I did, one of the first things I dealt with was that I'm not a very patient person, and a little tumbler like this will only hold 2 or 3 pounds of rocks, and to get all the way through a tumbling process and have a nice looking product, it takes about a month. So I started rocks in my little tumbler, and then I went and I got a great big vibratory tumbler that'll hold 18 pounds of rocks at the same time. And it's much faster. Basically what it takes a little tumbler like this to do in 7 days, you can do in a vibratory tumbler in about 2 days. And so it greatly shortens the whole process, and you can end up with a finished product in 7 to 10 days. However, it is also much harsher on the rocks, so you're going to experience more fracturing, you're going to lose a higher percentage of your rock. And so what I've been doing is kind of trading off between the smaller tumblers. I have 2 smaller tumblers now in addition to my giant vibratory tumbler. And these is the rubber tub for what's called a Rotary tumbler. So, it's a very much a trial and error process. There's very little written on rock tumbling, and you can watch videos. I've probably watched easily 20 hours of rock tumbling videos at this point. But it seems like people who get really good at it don't really want all their secrets to be known, and so they leave out key details. And I can tell you can get this little tumbler came from a National Geographic hobby tumbler that runs around $59, and it's really a nice little tumbler. But if you follow the directions that come with it, you're not going to get a good product. You're just not. So one of the things that I've learned are what steps that are just absolutely critical to getting a good finished product. And I don't actually have anything here yet that really reflects what I've learned, because everything I have is trial and error as I go along in the process. But it's kind of fun because you go out on the beach and you find things that look like this, which are nice, really big agates. And I've been afraid to put these in the vibratory tumbler. I think I'm going to give it a shot. But you really, when you find an agate like this, you don't want it to lose 40% of its size. So these were not ever that size. These are smaller rock agates that have just been run through 2 days in a vibratory tumbler, which just basically knocks the dirt off the outside. So you have a prettier rock, but you're not losing very much of the shape. This is one that was probably at least that size that I ran all the way through the process. And you can now see it's beautiful band. It's really a pretty rock. It still has its natural shape. The vibratory tumbler tends to preserve more of the natural shape of the rock, whereas you're going to get more of a rounded look when you spend a long time with a rock in a rotary tumbler. But there's a couple of things that are kind of critical that they're not kidding about when you're tumbling rocks. And one is that the grit that you use basically makes cement around your rocks. And so you don't ever want to pour it down your sink unless you want to replace all the plumbing in your house. So if you want to take up rock tumbling as a hobby, one of the first things you might want to think about is what's your game plan for getting rid of all of the cement sludge you make. Maybe if you were going to put in a new fence, it might be a good time and you could just use it for concrete around your fence posts. I don't know. So that's one issue, is how do you dispose of that kind of stuff. The other thing that most instructions don't tell you that's really, really critical, because they'll tell you to run 4 steps or 5 steps, or with a vibratory tumbler you don't run the first step. But in between each set that you have your rocks in, you've got to run a cleaning cycle with something like ivory snowflakes or something like that, because any grit that gets left in a crack in the stone that travels to the next layer not only is going to scratch other stones and that, but it's going to get cemented into your rock, and it's going to get harder and harder and harder to get out. So one of the things about a small tumbler like this, where you're maybe processing 30 rocks or so at a time, is that it's easier to go through with a toothbrush and really get that grit out and run it through a cleaning cycle. Whereas if you use the big 18-pound tumbler, it takes a long time to get 18 pounds to the next step, because it's kind of a process, and you can't just take a bunch of rocks and dump them from this step to the next step. Probably only about 40 to 50% of the rocks that you tumble are actually going to be ready to move on to the next step. The rest you're going to have to go back and repeat step one with, or some of them you may decide is just a no-go and put back out in the garden. So at each step, you're looking at the rocks and deciding what's ready to move on and what needs another run. And so, on some of my rocks, depending on where in the learning process I tumbled them, you'll see a little bit of cement or polish that's still on the rock that I didn't get off in an earlier stage. And in order to get that off, I would have to go back to at least the pre-polishing grit stage and leave it in that stage for some time. The other thing about rocks, when you're collecting on the coast, what you're most likely to find is some form of chalcedony or quartz. And chalcedony is the microcrystalline form of quartz. Chalcedony includes chert, jasper, onyx, agate. Anyway, those are the most common ones that you're going to find around here. Petrified wood is usually wood that's been replaced with silicon dioxide. So most of those things have a hardness of around 6.5 to 7 on the Mohs scale, and they'll tumble really nicely and get a really nice sheen. So this jasper, the jasper that's colored like this comes by different names, but one of the names for it is California poppy jasper. It shines nicely going through each stage of the tumbling and takes on a really nice sheen. It fractures in a conchoidal pattern, which means that it made really nice arrowheads, and when you're down on the beach occasionally you'll find ocean tumbled arrowheads, and they're almost always going to be either chert or jasper. Every now and then you'll find one made out of agate, but the pattern that they chip in makes nice tools. So in addition to the rocks that are silicon dioxide based, the other thing that you're likely to find that's a lot harder to work with is serpentine, which is what I'm pretty sure most of this stuff is. And serpentine's tricky because it has a varying hardness, anywhere from 3 up to about 6. And if it's not 6, it's not going to tumble well with jasper and agates and quartz. It's just going to disintegrate and chip and make pocks and scratches on the rest of your rocks. So I'm just starting to work with the green rocks and get a better identification. One way you can tell, if you try and scratch a rock with a stainless steel knife and it has a hardness of 6.5, the knife isn't going to scratch it. So, like this is a little piece of it's green and red, but it's jasper, and it won't scratch. This stuff I won't swear to it because I haven't done enough testing yet, but I believe is serpentine. And it scratches pretty easily with a stainless steel knife. So in the beach gathering, what's interesting is that rocks rarely are made up all of one thing. So again, the jasper is easy because if you find a piece of rock like this, it's jasper. It's all one thing. It's going to polish really nicely. If you find a rock like this, which hasn't been tumbled yet, I've got some little pieces of this, but it's going to be different things. It may have some quartz, it may have some calcite, it may have some serpentine, it may have some green jasper. And so you get really varying results. When you start with a big rock, it's not going to be very big when you're done, and you're not going to get consistent results unless you know a lot more than I do right now. So, but it's been a really fun hobby, time consuming. I've neglected lots of household chores and things playing with rocks. But you know, when you start out with something like this and you end up with something like this, you really feel like you've accomplished something. And as you go through the different layers of polishing, you get an idea of what the rock should feel like before you move it on. So if anybody wants to, I'll pass this around. Just feel how silky smooth that is. Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are there other ways other than tumbling to do stuff with rocks, and especially if they're larger rocks? Like, can you use like a handheld polishing system or something?
You can. People who like to slice rocks will use generally hand polishing equipment. You can also use a rotary tumbler if your rock is hard enough. But again, that vibration and that movement and vibratory tumblers are also really, really loud. I mean, boy, you know you've got one in the house, whereas these little hobby tumblers are just whisper quiet. So, in any case, I haven't gotten into that. There are sets you can buy that have materials for cutting and polishing rocks using polishes similar to like what you'd use to polish brass or something like that with. In any case, it's a fun thing to do. It gives us something extra to do, and Jerry likes for exercise going down on the beach in the morning, and so he's most obliging in bringing back buckets of rocks, and he's getting a better and better idea of what I like to use tumbling, and so my rock selection to start with is getting better and better. But yeah, that's pretty much it. These are examples right here. You can see the difference a little bit. These rocks are ones that have made it through the final process. These have not gone through the final process. They retain their color after going through a pre-polish before the polish. But I didn't move these on to the final polish because there's some chipping and pitting that I'm going to need to go back and run through fine grit to probably get rid of. And other than the fact that your rocks get smaller and smaller, there's nothing to stop you from looking at a rock and saying, I can do better than that, and going back and moving it back a step or even 2 steps, to get a more polished look. So
these have been run through
Only the first step to clean them. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. So this is just raw, just washed, just brought home from the beach and washed. These are run through the first step of grit. And then this is as final as I was willing to get this rock. I didn't want to lose the shape.
So the grit you're using, that's what, silicon carbide or something?
It is silicon until the polish level, and people change at level 3. So this is 60 grit. You don't ever use 60 grit in a vibratory tumbler. You only use it in the rotary tumblers. And sometimes this says 60. I don't actually. This came with one of the kits I ordered, but at this point, I'm ordering more like 10 pounds of the stuff at a time. So there's different things, but if you're using a rotary tumble, your first level of grit is usually going to be in the 60-90 category. What they consider medium grit is 180-220, and that's the first one you start with in a vibratory tumbler. And then there's arguments. Once you get from there, there's, I don't know, to me, science is an absolute. It's gray. This is a great hobby for lawyers who are used to seeing things in shades of gray instead of black and white. So at this level, depending on who you talk to, they have different ideas about what's best to use. So this aluminum oxide, which is used for the polish, you actually can get an aluminum oxide to use at the pre-tumble. And then there are several finer levels after this. So if you were polishing gemstone quality rocks, emeralds, rubies, you wouldn't stop at this level. This is a great, stopping point for hobby rock type gemstones. So these are other things that are kind of important. These are what are called tumbling media. This is ceramic media, and this is plastic media. And this is an area too where I've listened to what lots of people had to say, and what's working for me is different than what they said. So quite a few sites say don't use plastic media in a vibratory tumbler. What I can tell you is that when you get to the polish set, the final polish run, the plastic media really helps shield the rocks from pits and scratches, and it works fine. When you're using the medium and fine grit, then the ceramic tumbling media works better. But it is going to scratch the softer rocks, and it is going to add some scratches that weren't there in the final runs. And if you don't want them there, then you want to either go to a rotary tumbler like this, which you can use the plastic. You can use either of these medias with this too. The other thing you can do is you can just take your really little rocks like this that are not necessarily anything super special and use them for media. When you load a vibratory tumbler or a rotary tumbler, you want to use rocks of all different sizes, and you want to get a good, a good balance. So this is about as big of a rock as you could put in one of these little tumblers, and you wouldn't want more than one or two that size in there. The vibratory tumbler can take rocks up to about this size. So.
Kathy, you have some books for reference, right?
Yeah, I do. These little books right here are not super advanced, but they're a nice starting point. They have nice pictures, and these actually both came from Gold Beach Books and some of their newer books that they're ordering, and they're not very expensive. So if you just kind of want a quick little identification guide and a little bit on agates and common rocks on the beaches around here, these are both good sources, and they're made on pretty heavy stock. So
Can you tumble something like that, or will that come apart?
no, when you tumble that, you're going to get
What?
Oh,
What happens on those rocks where you have quartz embedded in other type of rock? What does it look like after a rock like that is polished?
Well, it depends. Like this one right here has both quartz and jasper, and they have the same, relatively the same hardness, and so that's going to tumble pretty well. When it's going to tumble less well is when the embedded rock doesn't have the same hardness.
A good example is if you go down on the beach, you'll find quartz or calcite embedded in other rocks. If it's quartz, it sticks out. If it's calcite, it's embedded where the mineral was.
And it's usually pretty thin.
Yeah, and so what happens with the calcite when you have these really nice rocks like this is that as you're tumbling in with other rocks that have a hardness of 6.5 to 7, is that all of that grinds out and it leaves a fissure in your rock. And that's exactly the kind of fissure that you're going to have 1 dickens of a time getting this polish and grit out of.
Is this real, do you think?
Well, I think it might
Because
be.
it's got the striation.
Yeah, that's my thought. So this has been through 2 levels of grit. That's been through medium.
What's the most unusual, like, rock that you guys have found at the beach? As far as, like, obviously a lot of what you're doing, you talked about the agate and the serpentine and the jasper. Are there other, like,
I
found
couldn't.
really unsurprising rocks at the beach?
I couldn't find it in my bags and bags of rocks before I came down. But there's an agate called carnelian, which is a really, really pretty red agate. I mean, it's translucent, but it's kind of a deep purple red. Those are not common in this area of the coast. We've got a couple of really small samples.
These could be considered carnelian.
It's kind of a golden, yeah.
Orange.
But these are, the ones I'm talking about are more of a deep ruby red.
I only found one once and I gave it away.
Yeah. So, when we found some fossils, I didn't bring the fossils down. Lots of partially tumbled arrowheads. I don't think we've run across, maybe Jerry has something to add. But I haven't found anything. Oh, well, I can tell you one thing that was I initially thought it was a piece of pottery because it had been ocean tumbled so smoothly I couldn't believe it was a rock. But it's not. It's called Dalmatian jasper, but it's not really jasper. Anyway, I have a pretty gorgeous piece of Dalmatian jasper at home that's mostly white with black spots, and it's got a little bit of a rosy tinge to it as well. There's another name for it besides Dalmatian jasper because it doesn't actually belong to the chalcedony family. So that would be different. We've only found 1 or 2 pieces of that in a year and a half.
Yeah, and different places, of course, have different rocks. So up at Newport, they have some blue agates. That's something you don't find too much here.
So this is called blue chalcedony, which is kind of like your, I've got a couple of pieces of that. What's interesting about this, again, this is really hard to tumble because it chips. And it's, I'm pretty sure it belongs to the chalcedony family, but it doesn't seem to be quite as hard. I would say it's more like a 6 instead of a 6.5. And so I've started separating it out and have a batch to tumble separately as soon as I have a tumbler free from other duties. So.
Almost everything you have there is igneous, right?
Well, silicon dioxide can be igneous, metamorphic, or sedimentary. And So
Like the
I would
Jasper,
say that I probably have a combination of igneous and metamorphic. This serpentine, I think, is more
yeah, metamorphic sediment.
metamorphic. Yeah, and so that's probably why you get the varying levels of hardness. But what makes it really confusing is that you can have serpentine and green jasper, which does have the hardness of around 6.5, and also kind of some low-grade jade, and they'll all be in the same area. So my first, other than learning to identify it in 8th grade, my first experience with serpentine wasn't as a rock collector, it was as an attorney, as a real estate attorney, and telling clients, if you find this stuff on your property, that's bad news, and you want a geologic report before you decide to site your house there.
Yeah.
You know?
Especially on a hillside.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Richardson Rock Ranch in Madras?
Yes, I toured that as an 8th grader on my 8th grade field trip. We went over to Bend and visited the lava center and all the cinder cones and Lake Pauline and the obsidian beds, and collected examples of all the different types of igneous rocks. My husband and I were in 8th grade together. We had the same earth science class, and we used to study for all these tests together. He didn't get to go on that trip because he was sick. So we weren't dating or an item or anything at that time. We didn't start dating until we were seniors in high school. But I brought him back a box of rocks from that trip that he kept on his dresser all the way through high school.
There's a nice rock place in Selma too.
Yeah.
Selma, or is it O'Brien? One of the two.
Yeah. Now the Peterson Rock Garden is just really phenomenal. It's so yeah, and there's a lot of fun places if you're kind of into rocks and cave formations and things. I mean, most of the places like that I went as a kid, to Mount Lassen area and Modoc lava beds and Crater of the Moon and the lava beds over in central and eastern Oregon, Yellowstone. They're all good places to learn about geology and rocks.
Well, thank you, Kathy.